had the opportunity to sit down with Sam Vallen of Caligula's Horse recently and have a nice long chat about a bunch of different subjects. It was a ton of fun, so much fun, in fact, that I forgot to introduce him in the beginning of the video. So here is my hour-long conversation with Sam from Caligula's Horse. When I was growing up, there wasn't really any sort of resources for learning how to do it.
Yeah, not at all. And the few things that you would find would give you a little kind of, glimpses here and there, but it was very hard to, really get your head around any kind of method or any real foundational information, I think. I definitely struggled a lot.
Yeah, and I have tab books, like I have Dream Theater tab books that are quote unquote official, but they're like completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so,
oh man,
it's like, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, that used to actually blow my mind because I guess like probably a pretty similar age. Like that was really how I kind of learned stuff like in my youth. And yeah, like half of it was just you'd play it and you'd just be like, really? I don't think so. Although I suppose that kind of drives you to, use your ear a little bit more, which is probably pretty.
Which is more important.
In its own right.
I probably should have done that more when I was younger, use my ear.
Yeah, I wish I did too.
I think tab books now are much better. Like they're edited more deeply by the actual artist, at least it seems like.
There's more care put in, if nothing else. It definitely feels that way.
Have you guys made tab books, like official tab books?
Yeah, well, so I have. We released a tab book for In Contact. Okay. I don't know how much I can kind of say now, but we've got a lot more on the way.
Oh, okay. All right. Well.
Like very, very soon to be announced. Actually, just for my own context, when were you planning on having this released? Just to work out how much I can reveal about different things.
I mean, probably within the next week or two. So if you have something like in the future, we'll just not say anything about it.
Yes, no worries.
Yeah, I got to keep the content rolling. That's part of doing a YouTube channel. Yeah. That's like the worst thing about it is like always having to come up with ideas all the time.
Oh yeah, it drove me crazy. I hear you.
But yeah. Did you watch the lesson that I did for?
No, I had a little kind of skim through. I haven't found the time to sit down and do the whole thing, but I noticed like discussing the motifs and all that kind of stuff, which I think is great because it's such a big part of how I think about music as well. But no, it looked good from the brief kind of look in that I had the chance to.
I'm just always curious, if I do something, and then if the actual artist is like, well, that doesn't, that's not right, that sort of thing.
No, it seemed to cover a lot of that, but again, I don't have a full knowledge of it yet. You can throw some of the observations at me, and I'll tell you or not.
Yeah, cool. So you guys just got back from a tour recently, right?
That's right. We just got back from like a fairly extensive one. Obviously the pandemic was a period where we really weren't able to do that for a long time in spite of our best efforts. But we did 3 weeks in Europe and then had like kind of about a week off where we were home, then went to Latin America, and then we ended with a festival in the US before heading home again. Okay. So it was an awesome kind of return to those things because, we really covered most territories that we usually do. Got a good sense for, how it all is now in this new world that we live in after COVID.
Were those your first shows coming back?
We did a bunch of Australian stuff. So, both like during the pandemic, like some live stream type stuff. And then also as it started to simmer down in Australia, which I think was a little earlier than a lot of the rest of the world. Because I don't know how much you followed, but like we locked down very, very hard in Australia. It kind of made the whole experience a little shorter, I hope. I mean, otherwise we just did it for nothing. I don't know. But yeah, so we did a couple of tours in Australia, both support and headline. This was the first time we headed overseas again, though.
Cool. Well, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. The U.S. is weird in that, like, depending on where you were, it was either like crazy or nothing, basically. So like,
yeah, crazy or don't even. Think about
I mean, I traveled around a little bit the first couple of years, and I went to Montana in 2020, and basically it just COVID didn't exist, And so it was so weird. It definitely felt like just kind of depends on where you are. It's a very strange place over here, but
but yeah, either way, I guess the difference was that we didn't really have the opportunity to do any kind of reasonable touring. Like we and I think every other artist in our kind of level had this constant push to be like back on tour as soon as we could, because, you know, again, I don't know how much you followed, but we basically managed to release like our biggest album right into the start of the pandemic. So we didn't get to kind of do all of the touring and stuff on the back of it. And that was, you know, bad, I guess, to say the least. But at the same time, I mean, you know, there was something kind of cool about releasing an album that was so much thematically based around like hopefulness, you know, in this generally quite dark time. So anyway, we in that recent tour, that was ostensibly the Rise Radiant tour. Like we'd kind of held off that long to do it, and now finally, you know, managed to put this album that has just been sitting in stasis for so long, finally put its touring cycle somewhat to bed. Like we've done it. It's actually happened.
Yeah. That's got to be weird to have an album, you know, 3 years later and you're finally playing this stuff.
It's absolutely bizarre. Like I've said this a couple of times to people. There's this feeling with the kind of cycles we do of like albums and touring. I say we do, like we did, let me say, where, you know, you really don't get to know a song until you play it on the road and play it every night and see how different crowds respond to it, and, you know, get both the feel for it orally as well as physically, you know, like playing it, where can you do all these different kind of moves, where can you walk around, you know, just all those little kind of the minutiae of the show. And we never had that with Rise Radiant. So we had this album that came out and it did really well, like commercially and all of that kind of stuff. But yet the songs were still something of a mystery to us in a really weird way. Like, you know, I knew the notes, but I didn't really know what it meant. So fortunately, I've now contextualized all of that. And, you know, I feel much more familiar with this album I've had for 3 years now.
I will say that Rise Radiant was one of the main albums that I kind of listened to during the summer of 2020. And maybe it was awesome. Like that hopeful element of it for me. Something about it just connected perfectly at that time. Like I love all your older albums too, but for some, I don't know, it worked perfectly for me, and it was great.
Thank you for saying that. Like there was a massive sense releasing it into that it was like, you know, this is obviously not the most optimal way we can kind of do this, but, you know, like there really was an element of we've written the album around this theme, which happens to be very timely, with no idea of just how timely it would become. You know, like our kind of responses, like thematically, like where a lot of that kind of push to hopefulness came from was other, now in retrospect, much smaller scale disasters that had happened. You know, we had some terrible bushfires in Australia, kind of quite close to home. We had a lot of kind of political unrest. And again, like, you know, all of that stuff, as horrible as it was, obviously paled in comparison to, you know, 3 years of basically being stuck at home and thousands dead all around the world. Like, but we didn't know just how relevant it would be. So the fact that it actually did resonate with you in that time means a lot to hear. It's
interesting that, I mean, that's kind of the power of music, is that you can write something with one idea in mind, and then to someone else it can be something totally different, you know, or
100%. We lean into that. It's actually something that, like, in a funny sense, you know, given that we're talking about, I guess, prog, like, is the kind of foundation here. Like, prog can be a very literal music, like in terms of the approach to lyric writing and stuff like that. You know, especially with concept albums where you've got an actual narrative told and maybe metaphor takes a bit of a backseat. We tend to be kind of the opposite. You know, like we want stuff to be able to be interpreted in a number of ways and not feel like it's a very direct and very literal statement. So yeah, I mean, you know, I guess that kind of speaks to me even further.
So along those lines, when you're writing, is the music coming first and then the lyrics and vocals are kind of like coming on top of that, or are they kind of working at the same time?
Yeah, we've got an approach that I actually think increasingly seems kind of idiosyncratic. Like basically most of the writing in the band is done by me and Jim, our singer. Other band members collaborate at times, but usually what happens is that I'll sort of start workshopping a couple of ideas, and as soon as they feel good, I mean little blocks of music, little, you know, chord sequences or riffs or whatever, starting points. From the very beginning, we start kind of talking about arrangement elements, like how would this fit, what would this represent, and from then on, like even if we're only talking about a building block or two, we're working on lyrical themes and ideas, so we kind of know first of all, what the music has inspired lyrically, but then, and probably more importantly, it's got this kind of reflexive relationship with like how the music is written from then on. So here's, the direction we're going to go, and this is kind of what it means. This is kind of what it feels like and what it says, so we'll start building lyrics and music in tandem after that point. And I think, again, like I guess talking about things that differentiate us a little bit, especially in prog, it tends to be pretty common that you get kind of lyrics written after music. There's a lot of prog bands where you could even probably make the generalization that lyrics are subordinate to music, like music, is the foremost focus. Obviously not always true, but, I think as a generalization, it's probably not unfair. Whereas for us, it really is like, I want it to feel like the two are integrated from the beginning, like there's this kind of holistic relationship between them. And again, like, whether that works or not, it kind of gives us a unique approach to the way we write, which can be really satisfying artistically, because you're always kind of writing towards something. You've always got an idea of, what it's supposed to mean and what tools you could use to kind of push it more and more towards that ends. So yeah, that's kind of how we do it. Very holistic, I guess, is how I'd sum it up.
Yeah, that is a very different approach, I think, in this style of music.
Yeah,
I think you're right in that probably most people in this genre are writing the music first, because it's mostly guitar players writing this kind of stuff anyway. So You're just like writing riffs and stuff, and then the vocals get tacked on the end. And I've done that before, but I do like that the approach of kind of like working on them in tandem together, because like, vocals are, if you're doing music with a vocalist, it's not instrumental, that really is the primary thing that people are going to listen to. So it's not just something you should tack on at the end. It's like, it's important that it's part of the song the entire time,
Well, I guess there's a lot of different values, I suppose, that music listeners would attribute to their pet music. And I mean, if you're talking about prog fans, you do get a lot for whom the instrumental side is kind of what captivates them in the first place.
Yeah.
Like being someone who grew up with Dream Theater and all those kind of bands, where at first, as like a teenager, you're listening to it and you're just like, man, this is blowing my head off how good these people are at their instruments. I increasingly kind of valued other elements, but there's a certain amount of, I guess, just the prog fan base for whom that is actually one of the big sells, and then things like lyrical themes might be also less important to them. Maybe there's a match between the songwriter and kind of the receiver of the music. But at the end of the day, like we can kind of have our cake and eat it as well, I think. So, with us, it's like we obviously put a lot of thought into that integration, like I said, but that doesn't mean that we can't be incredibly exploratory in the way we're kind of digging into, the instrumental passages, or even in some cases like the relationship between the vocal and the instrumental. But it is interesting to kind of consider, what elements of all of that the listener does value. Doesn't drive what I do, but it's an interesting thing to consider anyway,
Yeah, and actually, that's basically how I grew up, and as a kid, it was like, I just want to hear someone shred, and I was like, this is so incredible. But then if I go back to bands that I fell in love with when I was a kid, the songs that I love now are not like the crazy shreddy ones. It's the ones that feel much more like cohesive and connected and musical. So it's a very interesting
they've got that staying power as a result.
Yeah. It's like, because, I don't know, especially nowadays with Instagram and stuff, I'm just inundated with people who can like melt your face off, and it's like,
people are way too good.
People are way too
disgustingly good.
I just stay away because it makes me feel depressed. But but it's just one of those things where, in the end of the day, that doesn't like really mean that much. If it's just, on our page, it doesn't really mean anything unless there's like context, and where it's at. So,
100%. Yeah.
No, but that's very cool. It's the writing process for this kind of music is obviously very involved. So I'm wondering, live-wise, since you're playing again now, what's the hardest part of the set for you to play?
Oh man, that's an interesting one. I mean, obviously it changes as as the set list changes, but there's always a couple of songs that I'm ready for them to be a bit of a challenge. So like on the recent tour, Salt was a really hard one. Salt has this kind of, Salt Off Rise Radiant has this kind of rhythmic time bass where each beat is subdivided into quintuplets. Yeah. We kind of jokingly call it a quintuplet shuffle. You could also think of it as like a 5/16 or something like that, like a really fast rolling group of fives.
The trendy quintuplet swing thing.
Yeah, it's increasingly trendy. It seems like we all kind of did it at the same time, but it's one of those things where it's got a lot of technical components to it, but it's a song that well, I like to think, never really demands that you observe the technical elements of it. Like, it's quite an emotional song, probably one of the more emotional songs on the record. So there's this element of like the technical side being hard, but more importantly, making it feel like we're not pushing into a technical threshold where it sounds labored or sounds overly difficult. It has to still have a feel of kind of, natural performative space to it. So I'd say that's definitely one of the hardest ones. I'm just trying to think like what parts I dread the most. There's a couple of runs, like the big tapping run at the end of the solo in Graves is always one that I've got to hold my breath for and make sure I hit all of those million notes in that one beat, And Dream the Dead is always an interesting kind of technical challenge as well, like just all of the many, many guitar solos that it has. But yeah, I mean, for me, like the solos and things are they're always tricky. You got to get them right, got to play them well. But something like Salt is probably a better example of what I kind of lose sleep over in the approach to a tour, because it's not just about playing it; it's about playing it comfortably and having it feel good. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna stick with that as my official answer.
I can see that, because in my experience, like the technical stuff is difficult. It's like muscle memory stuff, and you get nervous and things are tricky. But
all the variables add up. It gets harder.
The rhythmic trickery is sometimes a lot harder, especially as a band, because you all have to like sync in together. So the things that people think are really difficult aren't always necessarily the things that are the most difficult to play.
Yeah, very much so. And also, there's this other sense, and this is going to sound like heresy to some people, but like, guitar solo, let's say like over the context of some obscenely long prog song. So you got like an 8 or 9 minute song, and you've got, in that time, 20 seconds of really hard guitar passages all up, like the hardest stuff. I mean, man, like, and again, this is the heresy. Like, if you fuck up one of those notes in the scheme of things, it's not as important as some people might think. Like, at the end of the day, like pulling off the whole performance and making it feel really good is just something that is so much more kind of objectively important, at least to the listener, their experience of the whole show.
And there's no such thing as a perfect
heresy.
No such thing as a perfect performance. I've never played a show where I was like, that was perfect. And
no, I've gotten off and felt pretty good about it. But I guess the argument would be more like that perfect isn't kind of that important in the scheme of things. Like, there's a much more important kind of quality of the feel and the kind of the vitality of the performance, like how well it translates and so forth.
And there's something about a rock show too that's really loud that I think you can actually sometimes get away with mistakes just because of the sheer volume of it.
Especially if there's some spectacle involved. Totally.
Yeah, like I'll attend a concert, and in my mind, listening to it, everything sounds perfect and it's amazing. But then you take an iPhone video and you listen to it later, and you're like, "Well, the singer's out of tune, and the guitarist missed that run." And so,
or you talk to the guitarist post show, and he's just like in tears for one note that he missed that no one in the crowd actually heard. But yeah, I mean, over the years, I've kind of, as I've become even more kind of technically comfortable with all of those parts, even so, I kind of, see them a little bit more for what they are. That said, though, I mean, when you do, like 6 weeks of touring, like we did there, there's this weird shift that you get. This is a slight aside, but it's related as well. Like first couple of shows, you get kind of that hyper nervousness before a show, like that kind of excited energy that you get. But once you're like a couple of weeks into a tour, that disappears, and you need to kind of simulate it to have the energy on stage. So there's this kind of sense that like while the show gets technically easier to play, it's also harder to play outward and to kind of have like that excitement on stage translate. I know that there'd probably be a lot of people listening to this who would have no idea what I'm talking about here, but like the line between, having just enough of that kind of nervous energy for things to feel exciting and, for there to be this kind of great interaction between the audience and you, to, 4 weeks into a tour, you're struggling to just like, you're tired, you're exhausted, you've played the same set or some variation of it so many times now, and you actually have to kind of lift yourself up to some degree. That almost becomes harder sometimes than playing the notes, because at that point, the notes, they're easy. You've done them so many times now, in worse situations than what you're about to. So, sometimes that becomes a little bit of a challenge as well, surprisingly.
You're tired from traveling too, going across the world and all that.
Haven't eaten properly.
Yeah.
You've just been, to the airport for 6 hours.
Yeah. Do you have to plan out, like in the later gigs, like plan out where you're going to be animated? Like, okay, this is the section where I go rock out and then come back.
It's almost, you know what? It's almost the opposite. It's almost like you just kind of find those parts. Like the first shows, the first couple of shows of the tour are where I'm a little bit more deliberate about like, all right, I can kind of go ham here and it'll be fine. Like by the end of it, you've just kind of found all those markers, I guess. You're 4 weeks in, like, that if you don't have your foot on the monitor for this one, you are not hitting those notes. You know what I mean? So yeah, a bit more organic, I guess, is how I feel that. But I might be alone. I know there's a lot of musos who actually much prefer having a really rigidly set approach to how they perform their set, I like to kind of be a bit more in the moment where I can. I don't know. I get a lot of value from that. The feeling of that is really important.
I suppose it depends on the difficulty of a part. Like, I feel like there would always be certain sections where it's like, okay, this is the part where I need to get my leg up. And, it's this really stretchy run or whatever.
Oh, definitely. But those, for what it's worth, those, I obviously do know from the beginning. It's those more kind of subtly difficult things like, nailing that perfect pinch harmonic or something stupid like that, or getting that chord change really nice. Like the kind of thing that feels fine. And then as you do it more, because this is the other thing about playing the same set or a similar set like night after night, you start to get this really great sense of the things that, although you felt good about them, the actual subtleties of the parts have revealed themselves more and more. This actually kind of jumps back to some degree to what I was talking about with Rise Radiant, like not really knowing the songs. Playing them in the studio is one thing, playing them live is another, and, knowing those parts are as good as they can be. And we might be talking about 5% here. It's a very small thing, but still, that matters a lot when you're playing it every night,
Yeah, especially if are you guys on ears or are you using wedges?
Yeah, so we do like not only ears, but we have like a full kind of passive split setup on stage. So, we mix our own ears and they're basically the same every night. Yeah.
Well, you really hear all of your little intricacies when you're, using in-ears.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love it and hate it. It's,
it's good and bad. It definitely holds you to a higher standard for sure than if you're just like amps blaring in the background. Yeah.
Well, that's it. Like, I don't think, I can picture a couple of moments throughout our career where, we had like kind of revelatory experiences of we're not as good as we thought we were, like first time you tour with a band who was just way better than you and you really didn't know the benchmark was there until you did that, like those kind of moments throughout your career. But, definitely a big one was moving to that kind of setup. So not just IEMs, but IEMs with a really good mix where every single element of ours is split. Everything is DI that isn't, drums and vocal. And it's inescapable. I remember the first couple of times we rehearsed with that, it was like, yeah, cool. We can now hear that 20% better that we can be because we're now aware of it. Whereas before, very, very hard to make out. So, yeah, I mean, there's that too.
Yeah. And well, before, if you weren't on ears, were you not on a click? Or was like...
So we've actually done it a ton of different ways over the years. I mean, I'm still a big believer in the idea that the majority of the experience of the click should be coming from the drummer and us playing to the drummer. We're fortunate in having someone like Josh, who is like both very, very kind of just... fundamentally groovy, like he has a really good sense of feel. He can really lay back into the beat, but also, he's very good at following a click track, especially as it gets more complicated. So, we started with all of us on the click. Early on, we kind of moved to just drummer on the click. Now we're back to all of us on the click, but I have mine mixed basically just loud enough that I can hear it in the quiet parts. Okay. So, we don't need to have live counts and things. But, I deliberately set it up so that the majority of my time feel is coming from my drummer, Josh.
Assuming you have a drummer who can stay on the click, that totally makes sense.
Which is easier said than done because, it's one thing to play to a click. It's another thing to really have a good sense of feel live to a click and also have it be, absolutely second nature. So the click is just gone. It doesn't exist in your ears. You can't even hear it because you're burying it, I'm
assuming you have some stuff on tracks with how layered your music is.
Yeah, we got heaps. I mean, the kind of thing where over the years we've shifted around how we do that. So like in the early days, we kind of just did what a lot of bands in, let's say the kind of 2010s did, where we did like a left and right split click and then backing tracks as a consolidated mono track, which went to front of house. But nowadays we've got a much more sophisticated setup. So I'm running Ableton Live and I've got like 5 different mono tracks lines, things like keys, backing vocals, like auxiliary guitars, stuff like that, just so there's a bit more control in front of house, depending on whether it needs to be a bit drier and more band oriented or you want a bit more control overriding those different elements. Because, like backing tracks are one of those things where there's nothing worse than either extreme. Like if it, if the experience of backing tracks is an experience of backing tracks live, it sucks. And on the other hand, like a band like ours, where, as you say, we are a very produced band. Like I am very deliberate about the way I arrange and produce these songs. So I don't want to lose my cool like synth pads or my interesting vocal arrangements. I want them there, even though we can't technically perform them that way live. Like it's not, really possible without having a Slipknot-sized band, which I'm not doing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the compromise,
Yeah, if you have so many background parts and you want them to be heard because they're integral to the song, but you don't want to pay 1 million people to go trail across the world.
Yeah, and I also don't want them to be a feature. I really want them more to be something that, like the people we work with, like our wonderful techs all over the world, have a good sensitivity to what they do. But the point, I guess, is like, we're a band that uses backing tracks, but I try and provide as much control over those backing tracks as possible so it doesn't feel like it's a binary on or off kind of experience, which sometimes it can feel like that. And, we avoid having things like, there's been all this hilarious controversy, which I find it comedic. Like, what is it, like drummers having kick drums on the backing tracks is the latest controversy, whatever. It's just like, I just yawn at all of that. I like, whatever, do what makes you happy. It's fine. But we also don't want it to be something where like the backing track is too much of a feature. I even deliberately write songs away from that being the case, even though in the early days of Caligula's Horse I was a little bit quicker to have like a keys intro or something like that, or multiple guitar parts that really all need to be heard. There's some of that throughout the set list, especially in the older stuff, but a good example is Salt. Like when I play it live, I play the piano intro on guitar. Cool. Try and kind of make it as band oriented as it can be while still having the production elements that I paint over.
Yeah, so you just like double it in that case. So what you're trying to say is that you've been miming all your solos.
Imagine, I don't know how I could get away with it. Like maybe. Well, I mean,
if it's on tracks, you could maybe like.
You just gotta like just flail, just do the
just
kind
turn
of
your
like
back, just turn your back to the audience.
Kind of I love it. Maybe one day, when I get too lazy to like rehearse before a tour,
exactly. Just don't even turn your guitar on. It's not even plugged in.
It's not even plugged in. Wait a minute, he hasn't been plugged in this whole gig.
He's just wireless. What are you? Speaking of guitar, what are you running gear-wise? Quad Cortex?
So right now, the guitars that I generally take into, you can see one of them there, which is JP15. Yep. Can't see the other one. Let me grab it. I don't know how video oriented your podcast is, but
well, I mean, most people are watching.
Yeah, this is my main guitar. So I've actually had this since I first started working with Music Man as an endorsee, way back in I guess late 2014. I think I got this, and I've done a ton to this. It's quite custom at this point, but the main thing is bare knuckle silo pickups, which are really, really nice. I've got the JP15 7 behind me there, which has bare knuckle nail bombs. It's much more kind of mid-rangey guitar, but those are like my two main touring guitars, and then sometimes I'll bring other backups and things. That said, next time we tour, I'm probably gonna have to bring quite a few more with me because I stupidly wrote some stuff in like drop D, and all of my guitars are drop A 7 strings with floating bridges, so it's not as simple as just jumping in and out. Anyway, this is what I've done to myself, so watch this space, I guess.
I mean, compared to some people, that's hardly any different amount of tuning.
It's not excessive.
Some people have different tunings for every song, but
yeah, exactly. I mean, for what it's worth, and actually it's probably a perfect kind of follow-on to that, like I'm extremely utilitarian about gear. Let me show you my pedal board.
Let's see
it's right here. So this is my whole rig live. Neural quad cortex, and then I've got a GLXD 16 wireless and a tuner, which I use just because I don't love because we use MIDI switching, like Ableton does my MIDI switching for me. I'm scared of using the Neurals tuner and just having stuff changing in the background that I can't see. So I like to have
so you have all your patches switching then too via Ableton.
Absolutely, nice. Everything. So yeah, I mean, you joke about solos on the backing track. I'm kind of one step away from that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, like my rig is incredibly utilitarian. Like it really is just the things I need and then nothing more. And, granted, like we are obviously taking like a fairly extensive, IEM rig with us, much more extensive than my guitar gear, including, the Ableton and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, like I just want some guitars that do well, sound good. They're not too pretty that I'm not scared of them getting damaged. It took me a long time to take that one too because it is very pretty and very expensive. But yeah, like, utilitarian down to the core. The simpler the rig, the better for me.
And I think that's a good kind of thought process to have. I think in this genre specifically, there's like such a push for gear. It's crazy. And like, I don't know, I've had the same guitars. I haven't bought a new electric guitar for like 7 or 8 years, and they work for me, and I don't really care. It's like, I don't know.
That's it. If it works, like the thing is, I still get that that push to kind of experiment and explore, and I really enjoy those things. But like I remember, in the early days of Caligula Source, like, when we would tour with heads and I would hire cabs in each city, and like if we were doing a support tour, I have a memory of supporting Opeth like back in like 2016 or something all around Australia, and having something like 10 minutes set up and pack down time after each gig, because often it is that when you're an up and coming band. And like I remember getting to the end of that tour and just saying, you know what, I'm not doing that again. What where a model is at. I'm sure I had my Axe effects at that point, probably the first gen. And it was enough to just say, look, if we're going to keep touring this hard and we're going to do these kind of gigs, I need a better rig. Like, this is just not going to work. And for what it's worth, I mean, at that point, the difference between, say, just as I guess one example of how the rig has evolved, like the difference between modelers and amps was pretty minimal. But now I would argue that through front of house, it is indistinguishable. And, anyone who tells me otherwise, show me a blind test where you can prove me wrong. But I also kind of just enjoy the aesthetic of a modeler like the Quad Cortex. Like, I can tweak and I can explore and I can experiment. And, whether the sound is, whether you're losing 5%, 10%, whatever, like I said, I'm skeptical of that anyway. But whether you're losing that kind of percentage, you make up for it in versatility and in what you can actually do with the rig. And besides, when I used to hire a cab every gig, half the cabs you hired would sound like shit, and you just have to deal with that for your guitar sound that night. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the other side of it. Like, what I'm saying is I've seen the dark side of touring with, big rigs. I don't like it.
I mean, there are some times, depending on the type of gig, that having like a, a loud cab and stuff is great. But the front of house people don't like it. Like, they have a lot more control if they don't have to deal with amps blaring, Yeah, it
does feel nice having the amp at your back. And I mean, for what it's worth, like for those musicians who haven't kind of toured with like an IEM rig, it can take some getting used to in its own right, because it is very sterile feeling, like it does kind of remove you from that experience of being shaken and moved by your guitar sound, which is awesome. Like, it's fantastic. It's the one thing that I've sacrificed for this, but it's a sacrifice that I'm increasingly kind of comfortable with, because, again, I have this threshold now raised as to how accurate I can be. I can't hide behind anything like that. And also I can basically carry my rig in two hands, which is incredible as well,
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the final product that everyone's hearing is the most important thing. If you're a little uncomfortable, but it sounds better overall, then that's a worth trade-off, to have.
Exactly, I would completely agree. Yeah.
So, I did a tiny bit of research for this, but you have a doctorate in music.
Yeah, that's right.
Man, that's very interesting, because I feel like, so in this style of music, like, there are quite a few people that you get like the stereotypical like Berkeley grad sort of thing. But then I also have come across quite a few musicians that don't have any formal training. I mean, what do you think has been like the benefit of that, especially doing this kind of music, to have a formal education?
Well, yeah, it's like maybe an unsatisfying answer. It's one that I've said to a couple of people over the years who have sort of suggested they want to, maybe students I've had who want to kind of follow in my footsteps and do that kind of thing. And I would actually go on a limb and say that my doctorate has done almost nothing for my approach to music making and playing. Right, it's kind of like a separate endeavor, and it's one that I get very excited about as well. Like, I love music academia and that whole world. But I almost see it as like they're two separate kind of hobbies or interests, or vocations, I suppose, in this case. Like, I teach at university. That's like my day job. And that involves a lot of, actual music playing and everything as well. But again, it's like it almost feels like a kind of parallel trajectory in a lot of ways to what I actually do with like my music performance life. So look, that's kind of the short version. The long version though is that like digging into things like music history and composition and music theory, obviously all of those introduce tools that you may not come across in another context. And like being someone who is quite thoughtful about the way I create music, like I'm really interested in being analytical, even as emotion is the main focus for me, which is probably something, you know, if we want to talk about songwriting, I guess we could dig into a little bit. But even so, just having more vocabulary is arguably always a good thing, right? Some people have that mindset of, you know, the more I learn, the more I'm going to kind of lose myself or something. For what it's worth, I'm yet to hear that argument made in a way that doesn't just seem completely like illogical, but whatever. I love having a lot to draw from. You know how I said before that the whole way we write is this very kind of deliberate like vision for where something is going to go. If you want to approach it that way and you don't have like a bunch of options available to you that you could draw from, it would be pretty unfulfilling composing that way, as opposed to just fiddling around and trying to find things that work and hopefully putting those puzzle pieces together. So, you know, that's the sense that kind of music academia and that side has definitely benefited, is if nothing else, it's kind of broadened my mind and, you know, broadened the painter's palette that I've got available. But, you know, how different my music would be if I never dug into that, I don't think it would be as different as some might think, I guess.
Yeah. I suppose at the end of the day, you're still you. So, you know, everyone has their own sort of voice on the instrument.
Yeah, exactly right. And, you know, I'm obviously writing this stuff to kind of satisfy a very particular itch. Like, you know, like there's a kind of end goal here that I don't feel like it's necessarily manipulated by the musical education or whatever I've got. It's an end goal that is very kind of, emotionally driven. You know, I want to elicit this kind of feeling with my music rather than, you know, I want the counterpoint to be perfect and that's the only way this is, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, no. And
definitely. I think music theory, like the idea anyway with technique theory, whatever, at least for me, is like you said, to have more options available to yourself if you're writing something, but also ideally you're not thinking about it when you're writing. You're not thinking about the theory. It's kind of like second nature. So to me, it's like, you know, this is a D minor major 7 chord or whatever. And like, you could break it down theoretically. I could do that. But more to me, it's like, this is a specific sound that this chord has. Where can I use that? Is that the right emotion for this particular part of the song? And so like, you're kind of using theory, but it's more subtle in the way. It's not like you're purposely like, well, I'm going to do this chord. Yeah.
It's funny you say D minor major 7 because the whole of Autumn and the Ascent off Rise Radiant are kind of built around a D minor major 7 chord. It's like a fundamental motif of the whole thing.
I use that chord way too much. Or at least there was like a period of a couple of years where I just used minor major 7 chords all over the place. But I've done like 3 lessons on it. But
I love it. Yeah, it's an awesome sound. No, I completely agree. I mean, it's like the more of this kind of stuff you know, I would argue the more deeply it can become kind of ingrained into your vocabulary. So, you know, when you first hear about some new concept, a new scale, a new harmonic idea, something like that, it's very hard for that to be something that you could draw from and then actually use in a way that feels integrated into the rest of your, you know, your kind of musical vocabulary. There's probably an argument to just say, like, you should know way more than you want to use, because the more you have, the more the right answer to a certain problem can appear, and the more familiar you can become with that idea, because, you know, it's going to be mulling around every time you're looking for something. It's going to just kind of be there, ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge, especially if it's theory, it's like, for me, I'm not writing from a theoretical basis, but I can use it to get me out of something if I need to. If it's like, I don't know, I need to like move to this key signature. Like, at least theoretically, I know that there's multiple ways you can do that, and I can try them out and see which one works, you know?
Well, for me, I find that when I do that, it tends to be something that comes in kind of the arranging mode a lot as well. So, you know, like there's something to be said for the intangible creating a new idea kind of part of writing, right? Very hard thing to rationalize in any way. I've tried to for many, many years. Like, you know, sometimes lightning just strikes and that's it. Cool, whatever. However that comes about, I don't really mind, but it does. But from then on, like in the actual creation of a song, like it's a fairly different set of skills, right? that's where I think theory is much more useful. As you say, you want to change key, you want to pivot towards something else, you want to create tension. Whether you're explicitly or implicitly engaging with the kind of theoretical side of your musical vocabulary there doesn't really matter. You just need to have something there to be able to draw upon. Because, I mean, imagine the exact opposite, right? Imagine trying to create something with a grand view to where it goes, but you simply don't have any vocabulary to pull from there. You'd just be blindly throwing a dart at a dartboard and just hoping to hit the bullseye, That's where I think theory allows you to kind of cater an idea towards an ends a little bit better.
And so, I mean, there's basic stuff you learn, like if you're writing vocal harmonies or something, like if you have some theoretical basis, you can do that all by ear and it can sound amazing. But like right off the bat, you'll know like these notes are probably going to work. These ones aren't going to work based on whatever the chords happen to be.
100%, yeah. Totally.
But even with people that don't know theory, because I watch interviews with great musicians that don't have a ton of like traditional theory knowledge. It seems like a lot of times they almost have their own personal kind of music theory that they've sort of created over time.
Have you ever seen how Alan Holdsworth explains chords?
Yeah, it's crazy. You're like, that makes no sense, but he just figured that out and it works for him. So
it works and it sounds utterly unique, yeah.
So there is kind of this, I think everyone kind of has at least some sort of system usually if they know what they're doing.
That's probably a really good way of putting it. It's like, because it is often sold to us as this like binary, like it's kind of dualism,
Yeah.
like either theory or you don't. But you're right, like even those who don't have a great intuition that maybe they've developed from jamming for years or just creating music. You're right. There's always systems, whether they're theory or not. In fact, that's probably kind of a revelation that those very anti-theory people probably need to be a bit more aware of.
Yeah, and then of course on the quote unquote we say theory, but we're just talking about Western music theory. We're not talking about all the other places in the world that have their own systems.
Other system you could have. Yeah.
So it is an interesting discussion.
Totally.
But what I always tell people is like, knowledge is always good. It's like you should never like not learn something. If you have the opportunity,
because you think it's going to damage you to learn.
And in fact,
totally.
For me anyway, like I found that stuff helpful. I remember, I think it was my sophomore theory class. We were doing 20th century music. And I heard the idea of a tone row, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So the first thing I did was went home to my guitar and wrote like a tone row, like prog metal riff, So sometimes inspiration can come from like weird things you didn't know about or concepts.
Oh, definitely.
I will say I actually watched both of the videos you guys made where you broke down the production of the two songs from Rise Radiant.
That's right. We did the Tempest and the Ascent. I think I can't actually remember now, but yeah.
I love that kind of stuff. Just like hearing all the background parts that you don't find like elsewhere. There's a lot.
Yeah, it's a shame we didn't get to do more.
Yeah. I mean, you could. I'd watch them, but probably not worth your time to just you. Me. Yeah.
No, I mean, like we definitely do because you say you like to watch them. I love to analyze that stuff after the fact. It's really cool to go back through and remind yourself.
I find just the whole process the writing process is really interesting, but then there's so many layers to it, right? Because then there's the whole production, recording, and I don't think, at least I didn't understand that when I was first starting, like how much is involved in getting a song from the initial writing stage to like a release. I just thought you you write the song and then you record it and then it's out. You know what I mean?
Magic happens.
Yeah. Somewhere it just like happens.
Yeah. Well, especially for a band. I mean, we're probably a band that puts a lot more stock into that than many do. Like, me describing that arranging phase of our songwriting, like it's almost all done in a DAW. Yeah. I use Pro Tools or Ableton, like depending on kind of what we're doing. And you know what? Maybe that's actually something that might be a little bit idiosyncratic too. Maybe less so now, but certainly it was when we were first starting out, that kind of idea of like a band writing in the room, it's kind of like a classic cliche. I always hated that. I had a lot of experiences with that kind of early on where, the fact is like loud volume and excited people doesn't necessarily give you the objectively most interesting or best kind of musical outputs, right? So, I kind of love the idea that as we're creating this, we're creating like very good demos. Like if you ever heard our demos, they're kind of, 80% of the finished tracks. You know, they're like, I put a lot of kind of effort into getting them together because you get this great sense of like really what you're hearing, you know, below the excitement, below the enthusiasm, like really how does it all fit together? But I also just love that side. I mean, you know, production is also a big part of my career. Like it's something that I value in its own right. So yeah, I'm with you though. Like, you know, when you're a young person, you probably don't realize just how big a part of the end product that element is.
It's such a, and I've gotten into mixing a lot the last, 4 or 5 years. And like, that's opened my eyes so much as a musician, especially actually as a writer and a composer, because like I used to not write with the mix in mind because I didn't really know anything about it. So you try to like, I don't know, for example, you try to have 2 different guitar parts left and right all the time instead of just doubling them, where in most cases, in a mix, it's going to be much more impactful to have them doubled for the most part. And then you can layer other parts on. And so I definitely recommend that anyone like get into at least some sort of basic production if they want, even just for their writing, because I think it makes a big difference.
Well, that's it. I was going to say, I'll go a step further and say, like, if you want to forge a career in music, you kind of need to be able to do that, because otherwise, you're going to probably burn out pretty early on. I mean, especially just with the kind of, before you start, trying to get a record deal, or before you start really trying to generate some income so that you can do that kind of stuff yourself. If you can't produce your own music, you're kind of starting on the back foot, I guess. I'm not saying you have to produce it like to a professional level, more just if you can't generate stuff that you can use to begin that discussion. Yeah, that's a bit of a problem nowadays. Whereas when we started, it was a little bit less, of a constant that everyone knows basic production skills.
Yeah, I'd say anyone, coming up as a musician now, like you basically have to learn all that stuff. And I wish I had earlier, but then again, the technology wasn't really at that point when I was in school. Like it was just starting.
It's very true.
And so, I'm kind of in like I'm 35, so I'm kind of in this weird age.
I'm 36.
I don't know. It feels like a weird age where like I have social media and like modern production tools, but I also kind of feel uncomfortable with it because I didn't have it till I was like 20, So.
Yeah, I'm the same. Like for what it's worth, I have to be kind of like forced to do anything social media related. Like absolute boomer in that regard. But no, I remember like in high school, like I was introduced to, I think, Pro Tools 7. I got on like that early on, way back in, 2002 or something like that. And it was a constant fixture of mine. Like I was really interested in it from the very beginning. But I mean, you remember what it was like. The kind of prosumer world didn't exist back then. Like the best you get is like an M-Box and Pro Tools LE, and you just hope for the best. You don't even have delay compensation, like things that we just take as a given now in the production world. But still, I mean, you couldn't stop me. I was so curious and interested in it that it was fine, even though it frankly sucked in retrospect. Whereas what you've got at your fingertips now as an up and coming musician, like, imagine downloading Logic onto your Mac and having, like a little Focusrite Scarlett or something, and basically having a rig that is comparable to what people 30 years ago would have paid thousands of dollars for. Like it's just wild.
Yeah, it's super handy. I mean, I kind of take it for granted now that I've done it for a while, but the ability to like, by myself create a whole piece of music that sounds like 50 people playing it or something, like an orchestra or whatever, like it's pretty amazing, at the end of the day.
Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. And that's the thing, I guess the difference between difference between us and maybe some younger people is just that I don't take it for granted at all, because I didn't have it good when I started out. It was much, much harder,
Yeah, I remember first bands I was in, you'd have to like scrounge up money all together to try to like pay for a terrible recording at a local studio. It would sound horrible. But it's all you could do,
That's just what you had, You had to make do with it.
So if you learn how to do that stuff yourself, then you don't have to pay all that money. But unless you want it done really well, right?
Yeah, and that's it. The beauty is, though, like it's much more scalable nowadays, because if you're an indie band and you're releasing stuff, you're self-aggregating and using stuff like Bandcamp to get it out there. I mean, the beauty is that you can kind of generate a setup to the point where you can actually get some passive income before you have to start paying for the expensive shit. Whereas, again, back in my day, like it was much, much harder to do that. You know?
And did Jens Bogren mixed your last album, right? Rise Radiant.
Yeah, so Jens is like one of my biggest kind of like production heroes. Like he's, especially like, well, I still consider kind of Watershed by Opeth to be kind of like really like a sonic peak in a lot of ways in metal, like both natural and big and powerful and nuanced and dynamic, the Great Cold Distance by Catatonia, like heaps of albums in that kind of era. So yeah, like basically, the budget got big enough because fortunately we had an increasing success between each album where that was on the table, and it was one of the coolest experiences ever, like stuff I produced, having that mixed by one of my heroes and seeing how he responds to it was just wonderful. It's really, really insightful.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say he's probably my favorite mixer in the metal realm too. Just something about his mixes they sound so good, but they sound natural too. They're not too artificial.
Yeah, he's just got a great sense of kind of like what the band sounds like. And I think, again, not to sound too kind of like boomerish, like it's really easy in this kind of the modern metal milieu that we exist in right now, where everything can be so kind of hyper real to the point where you actually lose what each of the performers sounds like. And to some degree, I'm sympathetic towards that. Like I actually love the idea that a 10 out of 10 dynamic feels like a 10 out of 10 dynamic, which, with a lot of kind of recorded music of the past doesn't necessarily feel that way. But someone like Jens, he's amazing at managing to have both that size to the production as well as the kind of nuance in the performed parts. So you can hear every element of the performance, but it still punches you in the guts when it has to.
Yeah, and I'd say like the drums on Rise Radiant, for example, they sound modern and powerful, but it also sounds like someone's playing them. It's not like
you can hear Josh's wonderful sense of feel and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's almost like a cliche, that thing of spending tens of thousands of dollars on the signal chain you're running your drums through, and then it just all gets replaced by samples in the mix. There's nothing wrong with samples. Like, I obviously use them in my own mixes as well, but there's a certain point where it just seems like absolute diminishing returns in even having a human perform. You could say the same thing about guitars once they're, just so heavily edited to a kind of grid or whatever. Again, I'm sympathetic towards the approach because it can be very aesthetically pleasing, but I just worry about when that becomes the primary approach to your production and you don't really have the kind of light to that shade, so to speak.
I think for certain styles of music, it maybe makes sense. If you're like a tech death band or something, like maybe it makes sense to.
You're exactly right. There's definitely a style where it's the right approach,
but not the kind of music.
Prog is a very dynamic kind of music.
Definitely not the kind of music you're doing. It needs to be more dynamic.
Totally.
How much are you? How much are you editing your guitars? Like, are you attempting to try to play everything as much straight through as possible, like long sections, or do you break it up more?
I deliberately try to have longer sections. The reason is, again, it's like I think there's this intangible element of feel to a performance that could be lost really, really easily by just having it done 4 bars at a time and gridded. So, like I'll edit my guitars where I have to, especially if it's something where I want it to feel quite uncanny. You want to have really hard stops or whatever. So it's nothing against the performative quality of that. Like I'm not one of those people who hear heavily edited music and think it's intrinsically wrong because of the manipulation of performance. I don't give a shit about any of that, to be honest. Like whatever sounds good is good as far as I'm concerned. But I do have this belief that if I can get longer, more kind of coherent takes, there is something to be said for that in terms of the way it makes the audience feel. There's kind of like a little bit of nuance to it. It's a little bit different each time. Maybe it's imperceptible, but I like to think that there's a component to that you gain something out of.
Yeah, I've kind of come around because there was a while where like I edited things like pretty heavily, depending on what it was, and then at some point I was like, I need to find some sort of middle ground because I loved how tight it sounded, but it also started to feel like a little, inhuman, and it's like
robotic. Yeah.
And sometimes you want that, like
I've just got
the gent rhythms, for example, like where you got stopped, like you got to like cut out all the space and have it be like.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like those, it feels totally stylistically suitable. I have no problem with that at all.
Are you guys working on your next album right now?
Yeah, so again, I guess it kind of depends when this comes out how much I can reveal because. The long story short, the new album is actually very, very close. Again, I've got to be a little bit cagey else than that.
You don't have to say any more than
trouble. That. But we have been working very hard on it. I mean, we have for a while now. I think the diplomatic answer is it's coming much sooner than many think.
Well, there you go. It's going to drop it out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Cool. That's exciting. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming and talking with me. Where can people find you? What shows you got coming up? All that kind of stuff.
So we got a tour with Devon Townsend coming
nice.
up across Australia in sort of mid-November. We're playing a little festival at the end of that as well. Beyond that, we haven't announced stuff.
Okay.
Suffice to say that next year is going to be by far the biggest year of touring that we've ever done. So, those who have, and this, I guess, again, like trying to frame this in a way that doesn't reveal too much early, those who've been waiting for us to come, I'm speaking to a certain subset of our audience who constantly asks for stuff. We will be there, wherever there may be.
There is in like where I'm at?
Almost certainly. Okay. If you're listening, assume I'm talking directly to you. Other than that, you can find me and us on, all kind of social media platforms. I'm famously garbage on social media platforms, but my band isn't, fortunately. So, feel free to give us all a follow and come hang out.
Yeah, well, if you guys make it to Seattle or the Pacific Northwest on your next tour, I'll come show you around. Say hi.
I shall say I shall remain tight-lipped and give you a wink.
Well, if it happens, some point theoretically. Perfect. Awesome. All right, thanks so much.
Sounds good.
Talk to you later. Bye.
My pleasure. See ya.